So this semester I chose to read This Is Your Brain on Sports by David Grand and Alan Goldberg. I initially wanted to read this book because it was recommended to me by my golf coach. He said it would be a really good introduction to sports psychology and it would help me with coaching, so I wanted to read it, and it ended up being really interesting and changes like a lot of the ways that most people think of sports psychology, so I think it was a really good introduction. So the majority of this book was dealing with how to get rid of RSPPs, or repetitive sports performance problems, and most sports psychologists deal with symptoms. So like if a player, all of a sudden cannot throw correctly, dealing with that problem instead of getting to the underlying issue. So how David Grand discovered that traumas have a significant and hidden impact on our performances, and that you need to adjust these traumas to be able to fix the cause of an RSPP instead of just symptoms. So in this book, the definition of trauma isn't as intense as it may seem. It's just any physically or emotionally upsetting event to the athlete. So spraining an ankle or breaking your shoulder and having to go into surgery can have the same effect depending on the meaning of it to the athlete. It was definitely interesting. They defined how the brain processes and stores normal versus traumatic events. So normal memories will take in all of sight, sound, smell, so all of our senses, and take it and just store it in the brain as a sight. But a traumatic event will be stored as all different types of senses, so it will seem more intense than a normal memory. They had David Grand initially worked with someone named Mackey Sasser. Mackey was a rising catcher in the major leagues and began having issues throwing the ball back to the pitcher, which allowed runners to easily steal bases and eventually became a problem. After being injured and being out for 6 weeks, he was never the same ball player. At the same time, the author, David Grand, had began his work developing new tools like eye movement desensitization and reprocessing somatic experiences, and he wanted to see if he could apply those tools to players like Mackey and help solve their problems. Mackey had seen many therapists before working with David Grand and had pretty much given up hope because nobody had been able to find a good way to fix his throwing issues. After Mackey met with David Grand, his personal and injury history clearly revealed his reasons for having these throwing difficulties. David had said, RSPPs are byproducts of gradual accumulation within the athlete's brain and body's injuries. So the issue of his yips came from injuries of getting hit in the shoulder and his arm being afraid to have that releasing motion, which caused him to panic and hold back from being able to just release the ball casually. Unfortunately, it was too late in Mackey's career to really regain, being able to play in the major leagues. But David Grand was able to get him throwing again, so he could become a successful coach, and he was able to throw in practices. So there was a really good quote in the book that says, "The athlete's mind and body always holds the answer." So David was saying how your body holds the answer. Whether or not you know why you're having these problems with sports, your body knows why you're having these problems, so you have to use therapies and talk through and figure out the reason why this was happening. I think this was really important because it was kind of a new way of thinking how to solve these sports performance problems. Most people just had been trying to solve symptoms and not the actual cause of it. So being able to apply methods that I'll talk about later to fix these problems that David Grand and Alan worked together on to create really changes the way that most people would think sports psychology works or how to help an athlete. Before this work, a lot of the times, especially like people that aren't super well versed in sports psychology would assume that, positive self-talk and trying to fight like the negative or the hesitations would be the way to solve a player's problems. But in reality, David Grand and Alan Goldberg discovered the best way to do it is to solve the traumas, and then those negativities or hesitations will go away, or it will be easier to deal with them. So I think the idea that the athlete's mind and body is always holding the answer is just so interesting, how the body stores those memories, whether or not the person is aware that it's doing that. The main technique discussed in the book to help solve these repetitive sports performance problems is called brain spotting sport work, which explores past physical and emotional traumas without consciously rehashing them. And that's a really important piece of it, not rehashing these past memories, because it can be especially harmful to younger athletes or even older ones, having to relive personal issues, because sometimes you're not consciously aware of the traumas that are hurting you. So being able to do that without, bringing it to the forefront can be really helpful. So the first way that they do it is eye location. So it's where they try to find the eye location in the brain that relates to the trauma that triggers the anxiety. So eye location in a person is, when it's activated, reveals where the brain holds the trauma. So they find the eye position by putting a client in an anxiety-provoking situation first. So if a golfer is struggling chipping, they're going to go out to the course and make the athlete, take a couple longer chip shots. And then they would ask the athlete to rate their anxiety levels 1 to 10, 10 being, I cannot even handle this, I'm so anxious, to 1, I feel nothing. And then they would find the eye position by having the athlete track the therapist's finger with their eyes while the therapist looks for reflexive responses, so twitching away or an eye shake or something. It could be super subtle, but once that eye position is found, the activation trauma is now held and it begins to unwind itself. So I think that's really cool how the body itself does it if you continuously put yourself in that situation. So there was a really good quote that kind of explains that, how the athlete's deep brain knows exactly where to go to find and release the problem. So the therapist is not trying to solve the problem. They're just trying to get the brain to do it themselves. So they're more as a guide rather than a teacher. So there was a case study involving this. Jerry was a seasonal professional BMX racer who was having problems in his bigger races. So he was relaxed and calm during practices and smaller local races, but once he got to national ones, he was really struggling, and he wasn't able to live up to his potential. So he went and met with David Grand, and they first listed out his traumas throughout his life to be able to see where there could be some issues, and he had a very extensive list, especially one where after he was being thrown from his bike that someone had hit him. He landed on his shoulder and broke it in 3 places, which caused him to have to go into surgery, and he was never the same racer since. So they were able to use brain spotting to find the eye position, which was slightly off to the left, and there were a couple other ones that caused him anxiety. And then they began the activation phase by having Jerry mentally replay the trigger event while listening to bilateral sounds. So they did this by just having him talk through the event while listening to these sounds, and the therapist just kind of guided him where he was supposed to go and didn't let him hold back and let the brain kind of do its thing. He was able to process his traumas and then be able to talk about them until he was unable to bring up any physical or emotional distress when he thought about them. So eventually, through multiple different sessions, he was able to talk about these traumatic events without feeling any nervousness or anxiety, which was helpful for him because after just a couple sessions, he was able to go back and become the racer he once was and wasn't afraid to hold back, and he started winning more. So, and Jerry was just one case of this working. There had been multiple other cases where this technique of brain spotting can help an athlete return to themselves literally in 1 or 2 sessions. If you have a more extensive trauma list, it will take longer because there's more things to go through. But like, there was one basketball player who had just sprained an ankle and he was holding back, and they had worked through it in, I think, 2 sessions. So he was back to being himself in 2 sessions, and it has a long-term effect that most regular techniques don't have because it gets back to that cause instead of just the symptoms. So, positive affirmations and being able to talk through those negative things may help you in the short term, but in reality you have to get to those causes to be able to have long-term effects, which I think is major to have in sports psychology, to be able to say, like, look at these long-term effects that we're having through these techniques. So it's contributing to the entire field because they really created a lot of new terms and techniques to help athletes in general. So I think this was a really great introduction piece to sports psychology because of how in-depth it really got, and just the multiple case studies proving how this brain spotting technique works. And it was truly interesting to see how just your body position can change how you are. Overall, I would highly recommend this book, and I think it was a really great read. Thank you.